Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Overwatch running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now the game is currently running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but this is at the full 100% resolution scaling. And you can see that the level of performance that we're getting here at the stock 15 watt TDP, and this is running on the AMD 22.7.1 driver. So this does have the DX11 fix, but this is a beta driver, and I have been finding there to be some bugs present in a few games, as well as some performance regression. So I would definitely recommend waiting until the final version of the driver instead of using these beta ones. But that's what I currently have installed. It's what has the DX11 fix, and I was curious to see how it would perform in Overwatch here. And the level of performance that we're getting out of this, considering it is at the stock 15 watt TDP and at the full 1080p resolution, is actually pretty decent. We're close to a 60 FPS average, and 1% lows dropping down into the 43 range isn't going to be the most unplayable experience, but there are moments of stutter throughout the game. It's not going to be very perfect, and there will be moments where the 1% lows will even drop down into the 30 range. So it's passable in terms of a gaming experience, but honestly, you can squeeze out some more performance out of this, and really what we want to see more than anything is an improvement in those 1% lows, because our averages are already pretty decent. It's just those 1% lows that drag down the whole experience. But it is one of those gaming experiences where I feel like if you didn't even have an FPS counter open and you just jumped into play, you would probably have a decent enough time. Although if you are a competitive gamer and you take this very seriously, then I think you're going to notice those drops, and it might be enough to just piss you off enough to maybe not want to play it, or maybe just adjust your settings. And using the AMD APU tuning utility, which is linked down below, and I link it down in the description of all of my videos so that you can easily raise the TDP of your system and get at least some performance boost. It's not going to work with every system, and there's a lot of systems out there that will not be able to handle the higher TDPs, so keep that in mind. But let's take a look at what 25 watts gives us in terms of performance. Keep in mind that this is a different map, so it's going to affect the performance somewhat, but I play multiple games at each setting to kind of just gauge an average overall of what the experience is like. And for the most part, things remain relatively consistent. Usually the differences between maps will be just a couple of FPS at most. So in general, the 1% lows here do actually see a nice little uplift. They don't really fluctuate down into the 30 range like it was before, where if there was an intense enough action going on, it would actually just end up dropping down into the 30s. This time around, it pretty much stays locked at 40 for 1% lows, and our averages are now well above 60 pretty much consistently throughout the whole gaming experience. So really, this is already a very nice gaming experience and well within the range of just using the built-in display, because it's 60 hertz anyway. It has FreeSync, and this is well within the FreeSync range. So pretty much you're not going to run into any tearing, and overall it's going to be a very rock solid experience. Now, of course, if you use an external monitor, you might want to actually get better performance than this, and we can see what a 30 watt TDP actually ends up giving us. But overall, 25 watts is pretty much the sweet spot right now if you're looking to play this with the built-in display of your laptop, and it's only 60 hertz. Now, not all systems with a 5500U are going to have FreeSync display, so that's something that you might have to look into, but I would definitely recommend getting yourself a system with FreeSync. And at the 30 watt TDP, what we actually end up getting is more of an uplift in terms of 1% lows than an increase in averages. The averages really just at most saw a 1 to 2 FPS increase, really just depending on the map that you're playing on. But in general, the performance of it was decent enough, and the 1% lows are now far closer to 50 than they were before. It's going to fluctuate depending on what's going on, but in general, it is going to stay relatively higher than everything else. And you'll see that the frame times in particular are just very smooth and consistent. So it is a rock solid gaming experience, but the temperatures that it's starting to reach here are getting to the point where I would not consider this to be a comfortable to play experience. The keys on this particular system do start to get hot and uncomfortable to use once you get around the 90-degree temperature on the CPU, and it really just ends up being an overall disaster of an experience. But not all systems with this chip are like that. If you have one with proper cooling, you can actually utilize this performance, and it would be beneficial to you. But in general, not a major uplift over 25 watts, so I would really just stick to that, because 25 watts is manageable, at least on this system in terms of temperature, but once you go to 30, it really just starts to spiral out of control. Now, if you're looking to get some higher levels of performance here, and in particular, if you're running at the stock 15 watt TDP, you might actually benefit from dropping down to 900p. You can see that the performance here at 900p is actually really great, considering that it is just 15 watts. for the TDP. Our 1% lows are in the 50 range and our averages are almost at 80. So well within the FPS range, more than enough really in terms of what the laptop has built in. And if you're using an external monitor, well, now you can utilize at least some of the high refresh rate of it. Not going to be a ton of it, but if you have a FreeSync display, then it doesn't matter. This is well within the FreeSync range of that, and you'll be able to actually utilize that and have a really nice experience. It just depends on whether or not you can actually get a monitor that has FreeSync over HDMI. I think at this point that's pretty standard, but I know for a while you could pretty much only use FreeSync if you were using DisplayPort, at least on some monitors. But in general, this is a very rock solid experience, and the hit in terms of resolution is just not too bad, so I would say that overall this is a pretty solid win. And going up to a 25 watt TDP just ends up improving the overall gaming experience that we were getting at 900p. So it really just goes to show that 900p is probably the resolution to play if you want to have the smoothest possible experience, because our 1% lows being at 60 means that it will never fall below the refresh rate of the display here. And if you're using a high refresh rate display, then you're just able to utilize more of it. Not a ton of it. We're still just in the 80 FPS range, but it's just going to be so smooth and consistent that you're actually going to at least get some benefit there. It's really diminishing returns the higher you go in terms of FPS and the improvement that you get. The difference that you're going to feel between 60 and 90 is going to be more substantial than what you're going to feel going from 100 to 120, and then 120 going to 165. It's all really just diminishing returns. And a lot of the times just having improved display technology is just better than just having an overall higher number. But let's see if the 30 watt TDP can actually get us into some higher ranges. And it seems like the 30 watt TDP actually does end up giving us a nice little boost in terms of performance. Now our averages are in the 90 FPS range, but it's nothing substantial, so I don't think that the temperature increase is really worth it in comparison to the level of performance that we're getting here. It's certainly nice and it feels really great to play, especially because the 1% lows are now even above 60, so you're never going to fall below the refresh rate of the display here. And at this point I was actually playing with an external monitor and it felt really nice to play. Now of course, playing with the external monitor, I was still using the keyboard on the laptop, so the temperatures that we were getting to here were starting to make it uncomfortable to use. So in general, it is impressive performance, but I really would not continue to play like this. I was more than happy with the level of performance and the temperatures that we were getting at the 25 watt TDP, so I really just would want to leave it within that range instead, because it was already more than perfectly playable on the built-in display of the laptop, and even with a high refresh rate display, it was still going to be good. So overall, 900p really does seem to be a champion here, but we can drop down to 720p just to see how that performs, just in case you have a system with a 720p display for some ungodly reason, or you just are limited so much on TDP and yet would like to still use a high refresh rate. In general, I just really would not recommend playing at 720p because it's very unnecessary, but the level of performance that you can get here is actually pretty decent. 1% lows are actually not seeing as big of an uplift as we saw at 900p, which overall means that the gaming experience is actually not going to be that much better than 900p, but the averages that we're hitting are pretty high up there and really solid, especially considering that this is at the 15 watt TDP. We're pretty much getting the experience that we got at 900p at the 30 watt TDP. So it is a really great gaming experience, especially if you're stuck at the 15 watt TDP. You are at least going to be able to do some high refresh rate gaming like this. Now the game doesn't look incredible, but Overwatch is one of those games where you don't necessarily need to be able to see everything in super high detail. The enemies are usually very big and bright. It's not like you're playing something like PUBG where you got to shoot at a brown pixel that's hiding behind a brownish green bush. It is far easier to see the enemies here at 720p than in a lot of other shooters, especially more realistic ones. So you can get away with 720p, but really I just feel like in general 900p hit the right balance of performance and visuals. But of course, one of the biggest benefits of the low resolution is that if we raise the TDP, we actually unlock a really nice level of performance here where our 1% lows are actually almost in the 90 range and our averages are well above 100, which means that if we had this hooked up to a high refresh rate display, we could actually utilize that FPS, though at this point playing this on a 24-inch display was pretty rough in a lot of situations. The resolution was pretty low when stretched out that big, and that's why like I say 720p is not really worth it on here, because you're not on a laptop with a high refresh rate display if you're on this chip, almost assuredly. And 720p is just such a low resolution that if you play like this on an external monitor, it's pretty rough. So in general, I would kind of just say maybe don't play at 720p, but if you really want that ultra smooth FPS, you can go right ahead, I guess. And it's the same if we go all the way up to the 30-watt TDP. It really seems like we've hit a ceiling in terms of the averages and 1% lows that we'll get, because depending on the map that you're in, the averages will be anywhere between 100 to 120 and 1% lows going from anywhere around the 70 range to 80s and 90s, all based really just on the map that you're playing on. Sometimes there will be some pretty major fluctuations, but they're usually far between, and in general, the level of performance that you get out of here is realistically very similar to the 25-watt TDP. So really, I would say that this is not really much of an improvement at all over where we were at from the 25-watt TDP, but the 25-watt TDP did actually have a noticeable boost compared to the 15-watt TDP. So there are some pretty major diminishing returns there. But in general, the game is very playable at all settings, and really, I think the sweet spot is 900p with a 25-watt TDP. And if you can't do that because you're stuck at the 15-watt TDP, then I would recommend either just sticking to the 900p and suffering with the slightly lower performance, or going down to 720p and actually having a really rock solid gaming experience just at the cost of the visual clarity. Now, depending on the size of the display on your laptop, or if you're playing with a monitor or not, that might be perfectly acceptable really, because honestly, on a 15-inch display, 720p does not look that bad. It's when it's stretched out on a 24-inch display or higher that it really starts to fall apart. But that really just depends on your own personal preference, so that's really for you to figure out. But anyways, I hope you found this look at Overwatch useful. I will of course be revisiting a lot of these games once the full beta drivers are actually released from beta status, so they're no longer beta drivers. Like the full release, when those come out, I might re-look at some of these games, probably not in video form, just because if there's no performance difference, then there's no real reason to mention it. But if, say, like Far Cry 5 and Assassin's Creed Origins, two games that we saw had pretty major regressions, if there's improvements there, I'll make a video talking about it. But anyways, I hope you guys found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.